So the Leica M10-P did something for me which I haven't had from any camera I've owned since at least the M7. We're gonna go over body, design, ergonomics, live view, impact on lenses, UX, modern stuff, how this all ties into one another. And as you can slowly start to expect, for most of my videos, there's gonna be loads of photos I've taken with the Leica M10-P scattered throughout the entire video. You'll get as good an understanding as possible of the capabilities of this camera. Roll intro. In terms of Leica, I'm transitioning to the M10-P from the M7 and the M9. I skipped the M240. The M9 already put on some weight in comparison to its analog predecessors, and the M240 was just a bit too big for my liking. I didn't like the way it felt in my hands. The M10-P, on the other hand, feels like every film Leica ever made. If that's something that you can empathize with, well, then that'll be part of the draw of the M10-P for you as well. For all intents and purposes, the Leica M10-P, it handles like the M7, and that is my absolute favorite camera of all time. It's the gold standard by which I judge how a camera lets me interact with my subject and make photos. So if you love the feel of the analog M's and the convenience of digital, being able to shoot a digital sensor in an M7 body, it's just huge. So I picked super sexy Silverado. My M7 is matte black, my M9 is black paint, and these are beautiful cameras. And I've got many other cameras, and they're all black as well. Some look good, and others look like cameras. And I hear you, silver is less stealth, but the look and feel of this camera is just something else. And I tell you, you would not be disappointed. It was clear from the moment I saw it, I was gonna go for the silver version. And it kind of reminds me of the Hasselblad 500 CM a little bit. I don't know. The touch and feel of the M10-P, however, it's just a tad better. So one of the first features you need to hear about is live view. Now there are a few pros and cons to having live view on an M camera, and let's get into the biggest con first, at least for me. It's disconnected me from the rangefinder window. I use it less. I use it a lot less, which is a shame in a way. I've previously spoken about the emotional connection to your subject through the rangefinder in my M9 video. I mean, using the rangefinder, it connects you to the scene, to the person, to the moment, like basically no other viewfinder will. It disconnects you from the camera and from the lens as well, and it's probably the most organic and direct extension of your camera to your eye. And it gives you just the right amount of information for exposure and for framing. And unlike all other systems, SLR or DSLR and all the EVF cameras except for the X100 series, it doesn't black out. You observe the moment as it happens, as you make it into a photo. There's no interruption, there's no disconnect, nothing. And I mean, I haven't stopped using it, just less, you know, a lot less. And I mean, this also, however, leads me to the most significant pro of live view. It's reconnected me to some of my recently lesser used lenses. And I'm specifically talking about the 50mm Noctilux, my 75mm Summilux, as well as my 21mm Ultron. Each one of these lenses has some really unique properties to themselves, which make them great lenses. But it's also these same properties that makes them sometimes a little bit challenging to use with a rangefinder, and the EVF solves this. Let's take a look at the Noctilux, for example. This will get a lot more usage on my M7. Now I'm pretty good at lining up focus in the rangefinder, and with the M7 and because it's film, it can be quite forgiving when you miss it a little bit. And that's because the film plane is just never as clinically flat as the digital sensor. And on the M9 though, when you miss focus, it doesn't look the same as on the M7, right? Because of that sensor. The fact that you missed focus is more obvious, and in a way it's a little bit less forgiving. And now don't get me wrong, because some of my favorite photos are not sharp, where I've missed photos. But there are simply times when it doesn't work. Next would be the 75mm Summilux, which is quite a long lens, and if my subject is within 1 to 3 meters range on the M9, it's fine. Any further, especially when there is a lot less ambient light, it becomes a little bit difficult to handle. And I'd run into similar issues lining up focus. Far less than the Noctilux, but still a bit of a shame because of the character of this lens. It's just absolutely gorgeous. And then of course, we've got the Voigtlander 21mm Ultron. Now the Voigtlander, it allows you to focus up to 50 centimeters. With the M9, the M7, that's basically guesswork. I mean, there's a few different methods with trying to estimate, and you can tie strings to your lens and stuff like that. But I mean, that's all just, you know, none of that worked consistently. Plus, you really need to ask yourself if your photography will allow for all that faffing around. I mean, mine does not. And that's the thing, right? Photography for me isn't a by chance thing either. It's intentional, and consistency is one of the pillars of any definition of intent. Each one of these issues is resolved with live view on the M10-P. And this is not simply just a solution to an issue to appreciate here, but the solution here has made me fall in love all over again with the dreaminess of the Noctilux. Check out this photo right here, right? Or the character of the 75mm. And again here, this is just, like I said, it's a gorgeous lens. And then when you start looking at the perspective of the 21mm, some of these examples I just showed you with these lenses, I might not have taken without the M10-P. On the M9, I would have probably taken the 35mm Summilux or my Zeiss 50 Sonar. My Zeiss 50 Sonar. Anyway, if you're interested in hearing more about these lenses, then leave me a comment or a question, and I'll probably go and do some videos on those as well. You can either use the screen at the back, or you can attach the Leica Visoflex Typ 020 or Type 020. Which absolutely does take away from the aesthetic of the camera. Right, as you can see. I don't use the screen at the back. I mean, often when I travel, for example, I leave the Visoflex at home. I leave it off the camera. If I can't make the shot without it and I don't have it on me, sure, I'll use the screen, but then it never happens. I mean, I'm one of those photographers that just needs and wants to put the camera to the face, you know what I mean? The Visoflex itself, it's not bad. It's good to have. It could be a little bit more responsive and a bit higher res, but it is what it is. And to be honest, I think this piece of gear was released back in 2014, so you gotta take that into consideration as well. Now there's a button on the front. It's where the film release switch used to be on the analog cameras, but I'll get into that in the user experience portion of the video. Is that the end of the rangefinder? No, I love my rangefinder, and the times when I leave the Visoflex at home are when I really want to connect myself to the subject via the rangefinder. And this isn't some nostalgic BS either. I mean, recently I was photographing a model and we were doing some very personal photos, and it took a lot for her to get into this place emotionally. And this is where I switch off the EVF and I shoot through the finder because I want to be connected to what's going on. No interruptions, and yeah, you know, I have no issue to live with the fact that I may miss focus here or there, but that's just technical. The focus that I don't miss is the one on her or the one on my subject. And let's get on to image quality. When I refer to image quality, I don't only refer to the sharpness of sensor or film, but also how flexible the resulting image is. Now for film, this often means latitude and performance under different lighting conditions, how much you can push it, what's the grain like, what's its color signature like. And for a sensor, it's similar things, you know, color rendition, dynamic range, high ISO performance, how deep the pixels are. Math photographer talks of this often. I mean, you should check out his channel, I'll link it somewhere. And you know, let him know I sent you in his comment section. He talks of deep pixels, which I kind of understand to mean how much you can get out of a sensor if you start cropping into it very heavily. Or in my case, you do some heavy editing. Now, on one end of the spectrum, you've got film. For me, the most organic in terms of image quality, if that makes sense. You decide what the photo should look like, more or less, before you take it. You know, you've got some adjustment possibility when you process the film and when you print it, but that's it. And then what you have is you've got the M9, which is in the middle for me. It's great image quality, fantastic sensor. It is without a doubt more digital than it is analog, but it is also the most film-like sensor I've used. And also, you know what's interesting is that Leica and Kodak made some choices here, some really distinct choices as to how the M9 sensor will render colors. And it's for that fact alone that I love the M9 and will probably never sell it. Like I said, this is what photos will look like, and what a distinct signature that is as well. And then you've got the M10-P, which sits entirely on the other end of that spectrum. It is a clinical and clean rendering of a scene that you photograph with a much more toned down raw file, and it makes it perfect for post-processing. How much of post-processing is entirely up to you. And so, you know, looking at this image for example, the M10-P produces an image file that with just some relatively minor tweaks from maybe to contrast, maybe to saturation, it already provides a beautiful natural looking photo. Or, and this is how I use the M10-P most of the time, especially if, you know, moods and ambiance are your thing like it is for me, I just take one of my presets. Hey presto, I have oodles of mood, exactly like the kind I like to get. You see, I used to photograph a lot of film, especially black and white, which I don't have the time to develop anymore. And there are loads of different presets that are available and all that stuff, but none which look like when I used to develop film. Very high contrast, grainy style photography. I used to push and pull film a lot, and the M10P sensor is just fantastic. It processes my presets just perfectly, and depending on the exposure of the photograph, I just have to do some minor adjustments. And that's what's so cool about this clinical rendering of this images of the sensor. It allows for some seriously heavy editing, whether you want it to look like it's edited heavily or not. There are some of you out there that will be shaking your head in a moment, ready to throw your coffee mug through the screen straight at my head. And some of you maybe less so, but yeah, I'm a big auto ISO guy. I will set the ISO to a specific value if I need to. If there's a need for me to set ISO to 100 or 400 or 800, then I'll set it. And if there isn't, I've set up the M10P to handle ISO questions for me. A lot of photography is more about the photo I want to capture than the technicalities of the image. And I mean, having said that though, the Leica M10P high ISO performance is great. I don't think twice about shooting in ISO 6400, 12500 or 25000. The grain introduced is really minimal, it doesn't destroy the image in any which way, and not in a way that I feel it takes away from the aesthetic. Combine the high ISO capability of the Leica M10P with the Noctilux f/0.95s or one of your Summiluxes, and you're basically seeing in the dark. You've got night vision going on right there. One thing to mention, if you're using live view in combination with high ISO and auto white balance, yes, I do that too. No, you should not throw anything at me for that either. But that combination, it results in a strong yellow tint at times in live view, and this lessens significantly in the DNG file, so I notice it more when I'm taking the photo as opposed to editing it. Let's talk about UX. Everyone's got a gold standard of camera to which they compare all other cameras to. And you know, if you've got one, I'd love to hear which one and why. What is it that makes this camera the one by which all other cameras are judged? For me, it's the Leica M7. Although a film camera, it is still the one by which I measure all cameras. You see, I like not having to think too much about the camera when I shoot. This way I can reserve as much focus and thought on my subject. Now, I don't know how the greats like Helmut Newton or Steve McCurry or Peter Lindbergh did it. For me, however, creativity, it doesn't flow on tap. You know, I need to actively think about it. I need to be in tune with whatever subject I'm working with. So one thing that is absolutely clear for me is I don't want to have to be faffing around with the camera too much. Now, I used to be a Canon shooter, and sure, after a while, like with any camera, you get used to where what is, and you use the buttons you like and you ignore those you don't. For some, it's great to have a button for every single function and custom function and functional modifier and I don't know what for this and that and the other thing. But then there's a group of us who really don't need to have a button for every single possible option. No, give us a small number of haptic buttons and some dials and some switches to set exposure and then focus, and maybe one or two other things, and that's all we need. And this is where Leica is simply the master. And this is another thing I spoke about in my M9 video. Leica's ability to show restraint. Das Wesentliche. The essential, it means in German. The M10P has just enough dials and switches for me to control my exposure, for me to operate the camera in such a way that it gets out of the way and lets me focus on my photography. And it's just really clear that the M10P, it continues this heritage, this M heritage, which is something that I truly appreciate. Now, this doesn't mean, however, that they haven't added a modern take on user experience. Remember I mentioned this button earlier on? It comes in handy when you're using live view, because when you press it, live view magnifies the scene so you can get perfect focus. You don't have to rely on focus peaking if you don't want to. And whilst in this mode, the wheel on the back as well, on the thumb rest, it allows for you to scale in and out of for your focusing purposes. And you know, hey presto, you got in-focus photos all the time, every time. Even my wife, who is not a photographer in the least, commented on this. When she used to take photos of me with the M7, that whole focusing thing, that took a whole lot longer. I mean, with the M10P, live view and magnification, this has completely changed, and it's a big plus for her and for me too. Now, all of a sudden, you know, she enjoys using the camera and making beautiful pictures like this one of me in focus. All of a sudden, I'm actually participating in the vacation as well. Vacation. Back to the M10P and a bit I truly appreciate. Leica have very cleverly made it so that when you've got an M lens attached to it, it recognizes when you're focusing and magnifies the image in the viewfinder automatically. This tiny little feature, I mean, it's, I think, something so simple, but it's something so cool. It's one button press less for me. It makes the whole shooting and focusing experience just so much more intuitive. And you know, it's little things like this which just add to the difference between this feature-laden camera and just a tool which works with you to make photos. If you attach any non-M lens via an adapter, like for example, this Nikon 50mm 1.2 to the camera, it doesn't magnify automatically. In fact, you'd have to do it manually, but that's where this button then comes in handy, because then you press this button, magnifies in, you can focus accurately. Plus this button does a little bit more. So if you're in bulb mode, for example, and you keep it depressed, then you'll get quite a few more shutter speed options to choose from, and these will vary depending on the ISO you've set. But that's just a small tip for you long exposure shooters out there. And that's not really from me, it's also courtesy of math photographers. So like I said, tell them I said hi. Now another thing I love, and I'm certain you will appreciate too, is the shutter. I don't need to have a super silent shutter nowadays. And when I used to photograph weddings, this would have really come in handy. So, you know, budding wedding photographers, take note. For my purposes though, it's more than enough if it doesn't sound like a gunshot. So, if I don't have a mirror clapping around, that's more than enough. With the Leica M10P though, it's different. The shutter is extremely silent. It's barely even audible. Every photo I take feels like a secret, something just between the camera and I. I mean, the first time I photographed Angie with the M10P, and I've been photographing her for the past 7 years now with a whole array of cameras, she was a little bit irritated. You know, she didn't know when I took a photo and when I was still focusing. She wasn't sure when to go to the next pose or not. It was interesting. It introduced an interesting dynamic. You know, I chuckled. I liked it. That discrete shutter sound, it gives me a satisfaction I can't really quantify, but boy, do I enjoy it. You know what I mean? For those of you that want to be discreet, this shutter will do the trick and more. ISO gets its own dial, which is great. Give me a taptic button, dial, or a switch. Don't make me go into a menu to set ISO. Now some will say that the dial sticks a little bit, but Mr. Chaparro at the Leica store in Zurich, where I purchased this camera from, showed me that if you adjust it with 2 fingers, then it's just fine. Speaking of the Leica store in Zurich, by the way, if you are in town, go and check them out. Tell them you saw my video, Olivier says hello, even just for a quick chat. You know, they're a really great bunch of guys, they're a great bunch of photographers there, and I'm sure they'll appreciate a visit from you. Anyways, between the dial being a little bit tough to adjust versus it automatically changing from ISO 200 to ISO 25,000 in broad daylight, with my Noctilux 0.95 attached to it, I don't mind. I'd rather it's a little bit tougher to adjust than it adjusting on its own for me. And I love the nod to the film rewind lever on the film M's by placing the ISO dial. Very nice touch. The back has a few buttons and a screen. No need to make more than what it is. I'm happy with the number of buttons. I like the directional pad on the right, the touch screen as well. It works nicely. I don't really use it that much. The fact that the screen lets me judge exposure better than the M9 did is awesome. On and off switch is by the shutter release, exactly where it should be. That's great for one-handed action as well. And it's kind of weird to even mention that because I've noticed on some cameras, and not looking at you like a SL2S, the on and off switch is totally somewhere else. And I mean, now you just have to use 2 hands to switch your camera on and off. And that just slows things down a little bit. And I like that. The thumb rest is quite helpful for this camera as well, especially, you know, when you've got a heavy lens attached. I never use any third-party thumb rest before, so this is a bit of a bonus for me. I like it. I also like the dial, which is integrated into it. You can set, like I mentioned, the magnification I was talking about earlier. You can set it from there. However, in my case, it's also set to set the exposure compensation when I'm using live view and I'm magnified into the scene, then it also adjusts the magnification, as I mentioned. So one last thing on the user experience front as well is the M10P weighs 660 grams. And I mentioned this because a few weeks ago or so, I was playing around with the Leica SL2S, which comes in at a considerable 930 plus something grams. And when you start attaching Noctiluxes and 75mm Summilux to it, it starts to add up considerably. Now, in my wedding days, I used to lug around 2 SLRs with 2 massive prime lenses attached to it, plus at least another 3 lenses in my bag somewhere. So it's not that I shy away from carrying heavy gear, it's just I enjoy having a compact, lightweight camera like the Leica M10-P, where I can attach the best glass in the world to it, especially when you consider size to quality ratio, and not feel like I'm carrying around a very heavy camera as a cost for that quality. And this is such a big draw of the M cameras in general, and it's a huge advantage for the Leica M10-P over other modern offerings nowadays. Let's talk about modern stuff. I can send photos to my iPhone via the Leica Photos app, which you used to have to pay for, but it's free now. I mentioned that with a bit of a stern look on my face because I paid for it. It does mean I can take photos, transfer it to my iPhone, import it into Lightroom Mobile, apply some of my presets, and then they're already ready to go for the connected world. And I mean, this is just super cool. On our second trip to Italy last year, I left the laptop at home. I love not having to carry more things around with me to do the things that I want to do. Remote live view means you can shoot self-portraits, like this one for example. Can be a little bit tricky with manual focus and shallow depth of field, but then again, it worked. Let's talk about some gripes and improvement areas. No camera is perfect unless you've got an M7 in your hand. There are some things though that I'd love to see solved in either a firmware update or an M11. If you've got a tripod plate attached to the bottom, swapping batteries with the tripod plate attached, it won't work. I have to remove the tripod plate, and I'm sure there's a way to figure it out, but it's just not the case on this camera. When I've mounted the Visoflex on the hot shoe, I can't see what the shutter speed dial is set to. Now I tend to shoot aperture priority, but there are times when I do more creative types of photos, like for example this photo of Natalie here, when I want to be able to control the shutter speed manually, and then I have to faff around a little bit. I'm sure the wizards at Leica can figure this one out. There's no video, and that's a shame. That's a big shame. And I mean, I'm not even talking about anything major here, just 1080p, 24 frames a second. Having said that, you know, if the body had to become bigger to include video, I'm not so sure. It would be great to have it, Leica wizards, this size camera with video, please, for an M11. This is a really easy one to fix and can be fixed in a firmware update, because when you're using Leica Photos app, you cannot use magnification from the app itself. If, however, you go and press the button on the front whilst you're using the app, you see how the photo magnifies on your smartphone. So the app is just missing that functionality to be able to magnify. And to be honest, that would be a pretty cool addition for self-portraits and something I hope that you guys add in, Leica. Finally, what would be really cool are some more EXIF options for non-Leica lenses, but lenses which are made for the M system. That would be really appreciated. Like the Zeiss 50mm sonar, a lens that is made for use on a Leica M camera. I'd love to be able to set that in the firmware here. So to conclude, this is probably one of the most subjective topics of them all. Photography is a beautiful and privileged pastime for many of us. And I did not realize that a little bit of that had faded for me over the past few years. And this changed for me when I bought this camera. Now you can name it many things: fun, bliss, satisfaction, happy, zone, Lebensfreude, feel, any number of things. For some, a camera won't give you any of these, and then there are others, like perhaps you and definitely I, who know what I'm referring to here. For me, this camera helped me rediscover the novelty and the joy of photography. I enjoy taking the M10-P, barely hearing, but feeling that dampened shutter, the touch of this brushed metal. It just invites me to pick it up, attach a lens, and go out there and create something. My photography has been a lot more intentional in the second part of the year, last year, since I bought the M10-P basically. I documented 2 lovely trips to Italy, I've taken many photos of my models. I use it practically every single day, and this camera has reignited my passion and my joy of photography. And yes, in some part because of the physical object that it is. It's a thing of beauty, with a great sensor in there, but more because of how this object lets me interact with what's in front of me, or who's in front of me. The photos it's inspired me to take, it's rekindled my devotion to the art of photography, the art of the digital edit, the art of creativity. That is how the Leica M10-P helped me rediscover the joy of photography. And that's it. That's all there is to it. If you're on the fence about the M10-P, well, I hope I unfenced you. If you've got any questions about it or any topics or areas that I didn't cover, then let me know in the comments below and I'll get back to you. If you liked the video, then I'd love it if you tap the like button. If you didn't like it, double tap the like button. And don't forget to check out the sponsor of this video, my 2 Instagram accounts. Hit me up there as well if you want to. I've got 2 because I've got one which is for main photos and one is for portraits. I'm thinking about putting them together. I don't know Instagram so well. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you soon. Peace. This is the 5th time I've shot this video over like a week. Twice a day. So good. If you're in Switzerland, you gotta check this out. You can get it at Co-op, the nut butter bars. Fantastic. Oh,